Picture a scene painted in hues of sun-baked earth and shimmering heat. It's 1888. A lone ship cuts through the cerulean waters of the Gulf of Aden. It carries not explorers or merchants, but a band of white colonizers led by a loot-hungry leader. Their audacious mission is to carve a piece of Africa for the emperor, planting his flag in the heart of Djibouti and establishing a colony with not really original name after the city from their native land. But their mission to forge a colony in Djibouti crumbles in less than 2 years. Underestimating the resilience of locals, the would-be colonizers are swiftly kicked out. News of the costly failure reaches the distant emperor, who lacks the resources to sustain the endeavor. So, humiliated and defeated, the colonizers abandon the harsh African landscape, leaving behind only the echo of their failed mission. So, this isn't some random episode from the history of Western colonial invasions. What if I told you that Russia wasn't just an observer on the sidelines of the Western colonial scramble for Africa? Yes, that's right. While the so-called New Moscow, a colony in Djibouti, East Africa, may have been short-lived, it serves as a window into a hidden chapter, Russia's own colonial ambitions. Despite what the Kremlin says today, they weren't that much different from Western colonialism. Hi, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian journalist and author of Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. For almost a century now, Russian propaganda has been pushing out there a myth of Russia being an anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism champion, a liberator of the oppressed. Almost every foreign speech by today's Kremlin contains these explicit references. But there is a massive gap between what Moscow says and what it does. For this episode, we tackle the myth that Russia is a bystander to Western-style colonialism. This is Matryoshka of Lies, the confusion. Look at the map and find the Russian Federation. It will take up most of the space in the Northern Hemisphere. It is the largest country by area on the planet. Look at the size. Do you really think that these borders came together organically in handshakes and hugs and brotherhood? There have been other countries in human history that were the same size or larger, but they were all empires. However, when we think of colonial empire, Russia rarely comes to mind. Why is that? First, there's a popular confusion that colonialism is exclusively about overseas conquests, whereas Russia mostly expands inland. Mostly, but not always. Take the example that we opened this episode with. Last year, it went viral after Ukrainian historian Oleksandr Polianichev shared the story publicly. He argues that not only Russia did cosplay Western colonialism, but Russia has been a Western colonizer all along.
When we say that the Russian Empire copied and emulated European techniques and strategies of colonial rule, we start from the wrong premise. Tsarist Russia was not just a diligent student of European colonial empires. It was a European colonial empire. It was part of Europe that projected its power across the globe and participated in the global imperial expansion. It was less successful overseas, although we shouldn't forget that Russia managed to establish and run colonies in places as remote as Alaska and California. Nevertheless, it was Russia's possessions such as Siberia, the Caucasus, and especially Central Asia that became Russia's real laboratories of colonialism. If we look at some of the basic elements of the ideology behind the Russian expansion into Asia in the 19th century, we'll see a familiar colonial toolkit. Russian empire builders shared the white man's burden, which implied that Europeans were destined by the providence to bring their rule to backward people, to civilize them.
Moreover, just barely a century ago, Moscow was quite upfront and proud about being part of the Western club of colonizers.
Russian expansion was also driven by mercantilism, the idea that the metropole should extract raw materials from its colonies in exchange for the products of its industry. If we look beyond imperial borders, we'll see that Russia was a full member of imperial internationalism. For example, Russian subjects took part in the activity of the International Colonial Institute in Brussels. Few people know, but Russian subjects also stood at the roots of the Free Congo state, created by the notorious Belgian king Leopold II.
So what happened? Why suddenly Russians started this confusion of denying that they run a colonial empire?
The fact that Russia is largely absent from the narrative about the colonial expansion of Europe in the Age of Empire has nothing to do with what Tsarist Russia's actual historical experience was. Instead, it has everything to do with what kind of stories the Soviet Union was telling about its imperial predecessor during the Cold War.
So when communists took over the monarchists in Moscow in early 20th century, Russians needed an image makeover to distance themselves from the controversial past. That's how the Soviet Union started actively cultivating an image of itself as a liberator of the oppressed nations, a stark contrast to the exploitative Western empires. This narrative resonated strongly in many parts of the world, particularly in newly independent Global South, seeking allies against their former colonial masters. However, Moscow would manifest anti-colonial solidarity abroad, but behind the Iron Curtain continued the colonial business as usual, but now with the communism label. Especially stark display was in Central and Northern Asia. I asked a Kazakh sociology professor Azamat Junisbai to share with us his very personal story of growing up in the region under the Soviet colonial occupation, which was marked by cultural, racial, and ethnic segregation.
I grew up speaking Russian. My mother and her siblings, all born in the 1940s, are also Russian speakers. In my school, Russian was the language of instruction. Our literature classes focused on Russian literature and our history classes focused on Russian history. The thing is, my family is not Russian. I was not raised in Russia. I'm an ethnic Kazakh born and raised in the capital of what was called Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. In the late 70s and early 80s, ethnic Kazakhs made up just under half of Kazakhstan's population and most lived in rural areas. Kazakhstan's capital, Almaty, was less than 20% Kazakh, because it was very hard for ethnic Kazakhs to get residence permits that would allow them to settle there. In the capital, insistence on speaking Kazakh instead of Russian was seen as rude and branded one as a nationalist. As a Kazakh kid at an elementary school in the early 1980s in central Almaty, I was one of just a handful of Kazakhs in my grade. At that time, the city had over 100 Russian schools, but only 2 Kazakh schools. At my own Russian school, Kazakh was taught twice a week, and it was the only subject that no one had to take seriously. We were taught that Kazakhs had no written language, that writing itself was one of the many gifts of modernity given to us by Russia. This was, of course, a lie. Prior to 1929, educated Kazakhs, my own grandfather included, wrote using Arabic letters. But, of course, Soviet propaganda had never let inconvenient facts get in the way. We were taught that Russia's presence in Kazakhstan was a generous gift of civilization. We were taught that Russian language was our lifeline to modernity. We were taught that Kazakh language was archaic and unsuitable for science and technology.
I got to be honest here. What Dr. Junisbai shares here hits close to home. Despite that it was easier for some Ukrainians to pass as white Russians, the privileged ruling class in Soviet Union, the life of Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians who populated mostly the countryside, was also marked by segregation. My Ukrainian-speaking parents were the first generation under the Russian occupation, Soviet or Tsarist, that were allowed to move and settle in Ukrainian cities freely. They were de facto turned into fortresses of much better life, of course, if you were a Russian speaker or Russian settler colonist. That was in the 1980s. There was, of course, a price to pay for my parents. I was raised Russian-speaking and knew nothing about my roots. Dr. Junisbai lived through a similar experience.
Of course, our textbooks avoided discussion of the Soviet nuclear testing, or of Stalin's purges of the Kazakh intelligentsia, or of the Aral Sea disaster. or even the horrific man-made famine in the early 1930s, in which an estimated 40% of Kazakhs starved to death. It pains me to admit that I had internalized the contempt for Kazakh language and culture baked into the Russian colonial gaze. As a thoroughly Russified Kazakh kid growing up in the 1980s Almaty, I looked down on Kazakhs with less than perfect Russian. Uncultured, I thought, uncivilized, rural. The fact that my own connection to the language and culture of my ancestors had been lost never bothered me. The more distance I could put between myself and all things Kazakh, the better. It seems that Moscow's colonization of Central Asia extended beyond political and economic control or even erasure of language and culture. I didn't just lose Kazakh language and culture, I learned to feel contempt for them, to be embarrassed by them.
Ukraine and Kazakhstan, such distant lands and culture, but sharing one colonial abuser, it all makes that distance less. That's why, for so many other people who suffered from Russian colonial abuse, genocide in Ukraine was a turning decolonization point.
The horror of Russia's war in Ukraine has awakened me from this stupor. My personal decolonization journey is intimate. It means reassessing basic facts of my family's history. It is painful. This pain is renewed every time I open my mouth to talk to my loved ones and Russian words come out. To quote Ukrainian writer Sasha Dovzhyk, Russian is my mother tongue and liberation means ripping it out of my throat. Russian is my mother tongue. Realizing in my mid-40s that it was never truly mine is disorienting. And the impossibility of ripping it out of my throat is maddening, a constant reminder of the lingering effects of Russian colonization. In societies formerly colonized by Russia, the danger of Russian imperial revanchism is well known. The deep-rooted Russian colonial arrogance towards Central Asians is instantly recognizable by Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and others. Unfortunately, in societies without direct experience of Russian occupation, awareness about Russia's history as a brutal colonial power is often lacking. I would argue that successfully obscuring the reality of the Soviet Union as a ruthless colonial power is one of the most amazing propaganda achievements in modern history and, at the same time, one of the Soviet Union's most problematic legacies.
There are more stories like these, but why haven't you heard about them before? Hence comes the main confusion. For decades, research in Russia was conducted primarily by Russian scholars who often downplayed the focus on colonialism and imperialism. Now, for too many abroad, it is uncomfortable to admit how misguided and disinformed they were about Russia.
I think there is a lot of geopolitical interest to overlook Russian colonialism because simply people don't know what to do with the fact that the Russian Federation is a colonial empire, that Moscow suppresses a lot of people based on colonial practices, that it's not simply a dictatorship, it's not a problem of system. Because when we follow the lie that the Russian Federation is not a colonial empire, for a lot of foreign experts, they think, well, we have a bad guy at the top, but if we have a good guy, then all of the problems will be solved. They are looking for an easy solution to the suppressions, to the everyday violence that the colonial empire actually exerts.
This is Dr. Botakoz Kassymbekova, a prominent Kazakh scholar who studies Russian and Soviet empire building.
And of course, the Russian Federation will stay a dictatorship or an authoritarian state as long as it is a colonial empire. But that issue is very difficult to face because we all can believe simply in a good Tsar who will come and change the regime. But it is very difficult to understand who can we imagine to come and promise so the colonial empire doesn't exist anymore. It also raises many different questions. What will come afterwards if these republics will want to be independent? Will they be good? Will they not be good? What language do they speak? Who are they? People know nothing about them. And, the world is largely disinterested in this question because they wouldn't even know where to search information about them. So I think there is an interest to overlook the coloniality of the Russian Federation.
Dr. Kassymbekova warns me that even the language we use to describe Russia abroad is heavily polluted by Russian colonial mythology. Sometimes we don't even realize it.
the Russian gas, the Russian diamonds, the Russian oil, the Russian natural resources, all of these words hide the fact that there is no such thing as Russian gas and the Russian oil. These are natural resources that belong to other entities with their own people who are not Russian.
But it cannot be just naive ignorance that the world refuses to see a colonial empire behind Russia, right? At least not always. Russia is one of the most important foundational blocks in the global fossil fuel capitalism. According to Dr. Kassymbekova, sometimes there's confusion by choice.
One can make simply deals and exploit nature of non-Russian people through Moscow. Moscow is a dealer. Moscow is a colonial exploiter who can sell, natural resources of other people, because if we have independent republics, we will have to deal with all these different republics, and maybe they will not sell their oil or their natural resources so easily or so cheaply, because maybe they will want to take care of their nature. Maybe their nature means something to them, like the latest case in Bashkortostan has shown, because Bashkort people stood against the destruction of their nature by Moscow for exploitative and extractive reasons.
Dr. Kassymbekova is one of the most important voices on Russian colonialism. She co-authors the upcoming Imperial Innocence, a book which will definitely become a must-read on Russian colonialism. We will devote an entire episode to it later this season. For those who suffered oppression or cultural erasure, colonialism is clear-cut. From Ukraine to Kazakhstan, this trauma transcends language and culture. There are, of course, important nuances and differences. From white supremacy in Kazakhstan to stealing ancient history in Ukraine, even the practice of Russian colonialism forms a wide spectrum. This is an unfortunate reminder that the urge to dominate or exploit is one of the fixtures of human nature. But in essence, gaslighting, invading, exterminating is a very recognizable pattern of colonialism to those who have lived it. And for those who haven't, it's easy to get confused. That's why listening to voices with intimate lived experiences of resisting colonial oppression could be the best antidote to this confusion, to move beyond simplistic narratives and start having a real talk about how to end colonialism for good. With this episode, we try to do exactly that. So please let us know if you like it. Ukrainian voices and media face lots of censoring and gatekeeping, both online and offline. So please rate and leave comments under this podcast. It will help it to break through the filters to the widest audience possible. This show is written by Yev Kopiika, produced by Alina Poliakova, mixed and sound designed by Dmytro, Volkovinskyi and Anastasiia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maksym Eristavi. Support the journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. Learn how at pravda.com.ua. The empire will fall.